For everything from video games, comic books, films, and beyond, you're listening to the Geek Guy Podcast with your host, Albert Albanese, here on the Slam Sessions Podcast Network. What's up, everyone, and welcome to another exciting edition of the Slam Sessions right here on the Slam Sessions Podcast Network. This is the Geek Guy Podcast. I'm Albert Albanese, and as always, you can find us on Twitter at the Slam Sessions, and of course, if you want to find us on Facebook, it's facebook.com/the Slam Sessions Podcast Network. This is a very special podcast for me. I know this is the Geek Guy Podcast, and a little bit later, when I'm actually not actually, I'm on Facebook Live right now for this part. When I go off of Facebook Live, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff that I want to cover over the next couple of weeks when it comes to the Geek Guy Podcast, but I felt like this is the best place to do all of this. Last week, we lost the voice of what many would call a generation. Chris Cornell of Soundgarden unfortunately took his own life by hanging himself in his hotel room after a show last Wednesday. This was a terrible incident for a lot of reasons, mainly because Chris Cornell was one of the most talented vocalists that I've ever listened to, and he inspired me when I was younger to become a musician. He's one of those guys that really inspired me. For those of you who don't know, I'll show my age right now. I'm 31, going on 32. I was born in 1985, grew up during the explosion of the Seattle grunge wave that had come and knocked hair bands right on their butts. This is one of those situations where I grew up in an era of fantastic music, and I'll never want that to change. I grew up at a time when bands like Nirvana and Soundgarden, Stone Temple Pilots, Pearl Jam, and Alice in Chains were all kind of coming up and making some fantastic music and just reinventing the music business. So for a while, I was growing up in the age of, some of the greatest rock that had come out since maybe the 60s and 70s. I immediately drew to two bands a little bit quicker than everybody else. Nirvana had always been the band that everybody really loved. Kurt Cobain, who I'll get into a little bit about Kurt Cobain in a little while, is heralded as being like this patron saint of grunge, and is heralded as one of the greatest musicians ever. And I'm not taking anything away from Kurt Cobain. I'll talk about Nirvana a little bit later, but the bands that really struck me were two bands, and it was because of the vocalists. Scott Weiland of Stone Temple Pilots is probably in my top 10 of favorite vocalists of all time. I just loved his range. I loved his delivery. I loved the differentiation he could put on his voice. My go-to karaoke song, if I'm a little bit buzzed and I think I can still kill it, is Plush by Stone Temple Pilots. It's one of my favorite songs of all time. If you guys ever see me in the street or anywhere else, if you just ask me to sing it, and I will sing it for you, because Plush is that good of a song. And if you guys are fans and you're telling me I watched your podcast or I listened to it, and you said you'd sing Plush for me if I ever asked you to, I will do it. So Scott Weiland was, one of those guys who really drew me in, and Stone Temple Pilots in general with their music. But, oh, man, the first time I ever heard Burden in My Hand by Soundgarden and heard Chris Cornell's vocals on that, I went, oh, my God, who is this? And this was back in the day where rock was played on the radio stations in New York. There was 92.3 K-Rock, and K-Rock played, all the biggest hits, and Soundgarden was heavily featured. And man, the first time I heard that song, because I heard Soundgarden before. Everybody knows, Outshined was really big for a little while, and of course, their penultimate hit, which I feel like everybody knows, is Black Hole Sun. And so I've heard those, and I heard Chris Cornell's voice, and I liked it. But man, listen to his vocals on Burden in My Hand. I'm telling you, that is one of the best vocals I've ever heard, ever. His voice is so powerful and so passionate. And he reaches levels that somebody shouldn't be able to reach in that song. And then he comes down and he gives you this throaty voice that just, that voice is just so killer. It's the voice of a generation. It's the voice that, was just recently silenced. And, it pains me to know that Chris Cornell is just another, is going to be looked at as another casualty of the Seattle grunge, field where, all right, like, let's run through it. Lane Stanley from Alice in Chains, maybe he didn't technically commit suicide, but he overdosed, and he didn't want any help. And he stayed in his apartment until he died of doing drugs, and his body wasn't found for like a week and a half. So to a point, he killed himself. Scott Weiland was in and out of rehab and, was probably the most worrisome out of all the guys back in the day. Everybody kind of just didn't know what Scott Weiland was going to do and where he was going to turn up and if he was going to turn up dead. And it's a scary thing to think about when you hear about that. And when Scott Weiland died a couple of years ago he died of an overdose. These are just these things where you hear about this and your heart breaks, because that, to me, it killed me. It really did. It floored me. I wasn't good for days hearing that Scott Weiland passed away. Scott Weiland is one of my heroes, vocally and musically. I loved Scott Weiland. I got the chance to see Stone Temple Pilots twice in my life. One of them was right after Scott had actually gotten out of rehab, and he was in great spirits, and he had pink hair, and he ran around without a shirt on, and he was unbelievable, man. I love Stone Temple Pilots, and I loved Scott Weiland, but in essence, he took his life. Basically took his life. And Kurt Cobain. I mean, we all know what happened with Kurt. Just he didn't want to be who he was. They painted him out to be this big patron saint, and he just wanted to play his rock and roll, man. That's all he wanted. And the pressure got to him. The industry got to him. The music wasn't fun to make anymore, and he blew his brains out with a shotgun. 4 guys who basically, you can say, committed suicide. The reason why Chris Cornell's death was such a hard deal, though, was the fact that Chris Cornell looked like he had beaten his demons, and it looked like he was okay, and he was performing shows, and Soundgarden got back together after a long hiatus, and everything looked great. And it's a shame to know that I had to wake up and hear the news that Chris Cornell was dead, and then when it was suicide, man, it broke my heart to know that another voice of my generation has been silenced. That Seattle grunge scene had a lot of effect on me growing up. I loved that music. I blasted that music through my speakers every day. Ironically, the band who everybody seemed to like the most out of all of them was Pearl Jam, and I may have liked Pearl Jam the least out of all of them. Sorry to any Pearl Jam fans. But just listening to Kurt Cobain wail, and hearing the pain and the torture in his voice as he played some of the greatest songs of our generation, is those are memories that I'll never forget. Hearing Lane Stanley just deliver vocals like no one else could, to the point where people actually literally wrote songs about Lane Stanley's voice and how people tried to sing like Lane did. It was just, it was eye-opening. It was an awakening. It was one of those situations where I heard that music and I was like, this is different. Alice in Chains is different. They're not grunge or, regular, Seattle-based, band or whatever. They're different. They're raw. They're throaty. They're live. They're loud. They're in your face. They got a kick to them. And I grew to love Alice in Chains. But, Pearl Jam came out in 10. Man, 10 was, it was a great record. There's no denying it. 10 is such a great record. And Eddie Vedder, his singing style, which is often imitated, and that's another thing. If you ask me, I will do my Eddie Vedder imitation for you. It's pretty solid. But Eddie Vedder, man, in Pearl Jam, they formed out of the ashes of Monkey Love Bone after Chris Cornell did a tribute to their lead singer who had died also. And Chris Cornell and the backing band of Pearl Jam, got together and they started their own group called Temple of the Dog, and they came out with a couple of songs as a tribute, and then out of those ashes, Pearl Jam rose, and it was Pearl Jam was great. Their first album was great, and subsequently after that they came out with some great songs, some great records, but for me there was I was just obsessed with Kurt Cobain, and I was obsessed with Chris Cornell's voice, and I was obsessed with the DeLeo brothers' riffs and Scott Weiland's voice in Stone Temple Pilots. These were things that I listened to those bands and those records and those artists over and over and over again because they spoke to me more than anything that was all the pop crap that was coming across the radio. It was those bands in Green Day and Metallica that got me into being the music lover that I really am. I mean, the Beatles had a foundation and Led Zeppelin had a foundation on me growing up in a household where those are the things that I listened to. But that 90s grunge scene was, one of those it was an awakening for a lot of people musically. And we lost the voice from that scene. And it breaks my heart to know that we'll never hear that powerful voice of Chris Cornell's ever again. So just for not just Chris, but for Scott and for Lane and for Kurt, just take a moment and play some of their records, buy some of their music, support these artists, whether it's Soundgarden or Audioslave for Chris Cornell. Go and listen to these guys, and if you haven't, given them a proper chance, do it, because they were revolutionary. They sparked a revolution. They changed music forever. And if anybody deserves it, it's those guys. So, to kind of end this portion of this podcast, just want to say rest in peace, Chris Cornell. And, rest in peace, Lane Stanley and Kurt Cobain and Scott Weiland. We'll always remember you. You will live forever through your music. No one who has listened to your music will ever forget you, because we're all equally touched by the music that you made. So once again, thank you for that music. And Chris Cornell, if somehow, some way you can hear this, thank you for all the memories that you've given me as a musician, as a person, as just, a fan. Thank you. That's going to conclude a little part of this podcast. I know that that's a little bit of a, maybe it's a little bit of a downer for a lot of people, but, the Geek Guy Podcast is about entertainment, and, music is entertainment. And, I really feel that this is something that needed to be said, and it needed to be, said by somebody who came from the side of a fan. I was never a professional musician. I'm a half crappy drummer, and I can carry a tune when I sing. But it was inspiring for me to hear these artists, and I felt that a tribute to a guy like Chris Cornell was warranted because, this music changed a lot of people, and it affected a lot of people, and I think it deserves to live forever. So, we're going to move on a little bit, obviously, from this depressing stuff. And, we're going to move on and we're going to move forward for a second here. I'm going to talk a lot about some of the big stuff that happened over the past week. I'm not going to go too in-depth about it because I went really in-depth with, this whole other part of this podcast. But I just want to kind of go over it and, kind of run through it a little bit. So we know that the Inhumans dropped a small trailer, which was pretty badass. Go out and check that out on YouTube. It was really cool. Also, the biggest news is that Spider-Man not only dropped a hideous new poster, they dropped another poster, which was kind of pretty cool, and the third and what looks to be maybe the final trailer for the Spider-Man film. Marvel just doesn't do a lot wrong. Yes, they got a lot wrong with one of those posters. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look up the new Spider-Man posters. If you haven't seen it, man, it's pretty bad, pretty ugly. It looks like something that my 5-year-old niece could have photoshopped together. But Marvel with that trailer, man, again blowing us away, and Spider-Man is going to be a huge hit. And, I talked a couple weeks ago about how I was most looking forward to Thor Ragnarok out of the big three Spider-Man films. I'm sorry, the big three Marvel films that are coming out. But I got to tell you, Spider-Man more and more is looking amazing. And, man, I know that me and Tom got cut a little bit when we did our first video podcast reviewing the Guardians of the Galaxy film, the Guardians of the Galaxy movie. So if you want to go check it out, the last 5 minutes unfortunately gets cut off, which really stinks. But most of our points are in there about the film. So with that being said, we've gotten a lot of good Marvel films, and I think Spider-Man will follow suit. 2 weeks from the recording of this podcast is Wonder Woman, and the reviews have been mostly positive, and I'm very happy about that because I think Wonder Woman has been a fantastic. It looks like it's going to be a fantastic movie. I think that Gal Gadot is going to kill it. I think that Chris Pine is an extraordinary actor, and he's going to do great. So I think we've gotten to a point now where we can see that these guys are going to come out there. They're going to kill it. Wonder Woman's going to be great. So go see it. Go support DC. I know a lot of people don't like to. I know I cover a lot about Marvel on this show. But go support DC because Wonder Woman deserves it, and it looks like a really, really fun, solid, kick-ass flick. So go catch it. And I'll, of course, do I'm going to go see it myself. When I do, keep your eyes peeled over probably if I don't go see it that Friday, it'll be that Saturday, worst case scenario, that Sunday. So keep your eyes peeled throughout all 3 of those days to catch my non-spoiler reaction to Wonder Woman. And then after that, hopefully I can do a video podcast, which will be successful with Tom. And we can do the whole thing, and we can capture the whole thing on film, and we can do a full-on review of Wonder Woman. With that being said, that's the Geek Guy Podcast for this week. It was a little bit of on a somber note, and this might not have been something that was grasping everybody's interest. But if you guys are a fan of me, you should understand that I'm a fan of this kind of music. And when tragedy strikes, I know I put it into the bottom of my my wrestling podcast and the Slam Sessions podcast last week, but more needed to be said about the impact that the grunge, the grunge community and the grunge rock industry, just that whole 90s grunge era had on me as a person. So thank you for bearing with me on that, and I hope you guys, who do like that music, enjoyed it. So next week, I'm going to come back with a lot more of a concise show, a lot more stuff to talk about. I'm going to actually give a comic of the week, and I'm going to try, so I know you guys like it, to get Tom to come down to the studio with me so we can do a show together. So, look, if that's something you guys really do want to see too, please follow me on Facebook.com/The Slam Sessions Podcast Network. Follow me on Twitter @The Slam Sessions. Tweet me, Facebook me. Ask me, tell me, dude, get Tom back in that chair with you, because if that's what you guys want, that's what I'm going to do. So get interactive. I want to get these shows a little more interactive, especially this podcast. I'm going to work on that. Some changes are coming. I'm going to, redo some of the credits. I'm going to redo, I'm going to, maybe give a little bit more of a format for the shows, to making them a little more interactive, a little bit more fun, and I'm going to try to find ways to get them out to you a little bit sooner, like I did with Facebook Live. So thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for your support. Please like, share, subscribe, please, because that helps me out a lot. And this is my dream and this is my passion, and I want to share this with everyone. So thank you for your support, and thank you for everything, and I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for listening to the Geek Guy Podcast, right here on the Slam Sessions Podcast Network. You can follow us on Twitter @The Slam Sessions. We'll see you guys next time, and may the force be with you.